Hi, this is Steve from YouthWorker. We're at the National Youth Worker Convention in Cincinnati. I like hanging out with smart people. That's why I'm here with Andrew Root. Andrew is a youth ministry professor, author of numerous gala books which our reviewers love. The latest one is called Relationships Unfiltered. That's like a sequel to his earlier relationship book because he made $1 million and he figured, hey, I can make another million if I just use relationships again. Isn't that right? Is that?
Yeah, I'm still waiting for that check to come in the mail. No, I wish it would have made $1 million for the good of what I could do with that money, but yeah.
But what is it with relationships? I mean, what are you trying to tell youth workers about relationships? The good ones? I mean, what are you trying to say to us?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fair comment to say that relationships have been a central part of youth ministry, maybe since at least its conception, at least it's kind of modern youth ministry in the middle of the 20th century. And I think it's been a really good thing, and that there's good reasons that we've focused on relationships. But my point in the two books is trying to drive that more theologically, to ask really what are relationships about and what are relationships for. And I think too often in youth ministry particularly, we've seen relationships as the purpose of influencing kids, that we've used the relationship as a carrot or as a bridge to get kids to do things, or get kids to be things, or get kids to commit to something. And I think some of those things are really good, but I tried to re-explore what relationships really are and tried to look at how relationships might actually be the place where God meets us, that we may even encounter God in a relationship. So it's kind of about recasting what relationships are theologically for our ministry.
Interesting. And there's a large parachurch organization that we don't need to name, but for a long time they were talking about relational evangelism. And part of that I thought, oh, this is a good thing, but part of it is like there's a you're using the relationship to advance a goal, which makes it seem like the relationship doesn't matter that much. Or is that part of what you're trying to do?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. That what's really ironic is when we use the relationship as a goal, as a means to another end, then really, at the end, the relationship doesn't matter. Yeah. What really matters is where you've gotten the kid, whatever that might be. But that's what matters. That the relationship itself is really a tool. It's really an instrument that you use to get the kid somewhere else. And what I tried to do is explore what would it mean if the relationship was it. If the relationship was the place where we really encountered each other, where we really sought for God, and maybe the place where real transformation happened, both socially for young people, but also in a real spiritual way as well. So I tried to see the relationship as the end and as the goal in and of itself of ministry, which I think connects more to a biblical theological understanding of who God is, that God really desires for us to be in relationship with God.
Well, I was going to ask you what your biblical proof text was on this whole thing, because a lot of us like relationships, but it's like it's very modern and kind of therapeutic and touchy. How would you argue this is like how God wants us to do things?
Right. Well, I mean, you can, and I think what youth ministry has probably done too little or what it's probably done too little is develop a theological perspective, and when it's done too often is use kind of bullet pointed Bible verses to justify its theological perspective. So not that that is bad, but what I've tried to do is look at larger theological motifs as a way into this, because I think what theology ultimately is not bullet point Bible verses, but a way of thinking and seeing reality in a different way. This idea that God is actually active in the world, that God comes to us in the person of Jesus Christ. So the motifs that I've tried to use theologically in my own work are to think of things like the Incarnation, and not just the Incarnation as this articulation of two Bible verses at the beginning of John's Gospel, but this full reality of this commitment of God entering into our world. Or even to look at the Trinity as this reality where relationality and relationship is essential to even who God is, and being invited into that. So proof texting it would be hard, though we could find texts, and we could find biblical examples. But I'm trying to go after something more than that. I'm trying to pull us into a way of actually being theologians and doing theology, where we try to enter into the reality of God's activity in the world, as opposed to finding Bible verses that can become our bumper stickers to justify what we do. Or trying to make God's action more primary in the midst of that.
And it sounds like you're one of those people that think the Incarnation, that's more than something we just pull down on December and use during the Christmas period and creches and all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, I think that the Incarnation is maybe the very hinge of God's own ministry in the world. A salvation history, that the Incarnation is really the hinge of that. Now, when we say that, I think that you can never discount or disconnect Incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection. I think they're in a narrative that all fits together. And what's interesting about youth ministry is we've tended to think of relationships and use the theology of the Incarnation, or use the Incarnation to justify us using relationships in youth ministry, but we've rarely connected that and had that move us into talking about crucifixion and resurrection, and what those theological motifs mean for how we do ministry, and how you can't disconnect those from Incarnation. If we want to talk about being incarnational in youth ministry, we also have to do that in a cruciform way, in the way of the cross, and in a way that hopes in the fulfillment of the resurrection and God's continued work in creation. And I think youth ministry in this parachurch organization that can remain nameless, that I was trained in and that I still have fond feelings for, we tended to always talk about the Incarnation, but rarely talked about how cross and resurrection were just as mobilizing for ministry as the Incarnation was. So that's kind of, in both books, I'm after holding those things together, which actually Reformation theology has always asserted you can't disconnect those things. That Incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection is to make the commitment and the confession of who Jesus Christ is.